Hi, my name is Andrew Sears, and I'm the president of City Vision University. I'm also the course designer for this course, CrossCultural Management. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the course, but I also want to talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of online learning. Part of the reason is in cross-cultural management, probably more than any of the topics that we cover, it's really important to recognize what can be done through head learning, what can be done through heart learning, and what has to be done by doing. Head learning can be done really well through online courses. It's mainly what you're going to get from this course and books. Heart learning, and that is, where really it takes a long period of time to really understand at a heart level things like injustice. Really the best way is to experience long-term suffering as someone who's experienced oppression and cross-cultural systems. Then there's, on the personal level, mercy, it's just having deep cross-cultural friendships and relationships, and also just having long-term experience as a cultural minority. And then the third area of doing is really just experience in working cross-culturally, leading cross-cultural organizations, seeing what works, what doesn't, having cross-cultural fluency from long-term experience in cross-cultural settings. If you're trying to learn another language, then spending a year in that other country and where you're using the language every day. So ultimately, a lot of it's going to be, in the doing. Now, let me tell you a little my own experience in this. So, I'm a white male, so that's going to, grew up in the United States, and that's going to color some of how I approach this. Having said that, I grew up in the African American community. Primarily, I grew up poor, and but I later went to college. Whenever I went to college, people thought it was unusual that there's this white kid who talked like he was black, and I didn't even know that that was unusual because that's just how I grew up. And so that was a lot of the beginning of, my becoming aware of these things. For about 40 years of my life, I've lived and worked among the poor, and because of that, I've experienced some pretty significant trauma in that. And I've had, most of my friendships, a lot of my deep friendships have been cross-cultural, and have spent probably the majority of my life in at least significant parts where I was in a minority context. And I've spent the past 20 years leading a cross-cultural organization. There were seasons at our organization where I was the only white person on staff, and everyone else was a person of color. Whenever we ran a National AmeriCorps program, out of 100 grantees, we had the one that had the highest percentage of Black and Latino AmeriCorps members and Black and Latino-led sites. So, I understand how to lead cross-culturally in a lot of ways, and in other ways, I'm still learning. My perspective is much more around cross-cultural ministry in the U.S. Globally, I've learned a decent amount. I've lived in South Africa for a summer. I've traveled and had, pretty extensive friendships. But having said that, I don't have the experience of someone who's lived overseas, for 20 years. So one of the main reasons why I say that is I've seen people take this material and they get a lot of head knowledge, but they haven't done the other. So all of a sudden, one of the things we're going to do is have you make recommendations to your organization. And we would have done you a disservice if you get a bunch of head knowledge and all of a sudden think you know what to do with your organization, but don't have the humility that comes with the heart learning and the hand learning. So just recognize that as you approach this course. Now, having said that, I want to go into the course learning objectives. What we're trying to do in this course is we're trying to make it so that you can, by the end of the course, you can show that you can demonstrate an understanding of cultural dimensions. And what cultural dimensions are, if any of you have taken personality tests like Myers-Briggs and you have these different things like perceiving or judging, there's similar dimensions to personalities. personality test, but it's applying it across cultures. Then, using various tools to analyze individual and organizational aspects of culture. Then evaluate an organization's culture and how its culturally distinctive impact can relate to its customers, employees, and overall market or clients, if you're talking about a nonprofit. And the end goal, and you always want to go into a course recognizing, okay, what's the end goal? The end goal is you're going to be writing a consulting report, evaluating an organization's culture, and cross-cultural effectiveness, and developing strategic recommendations. So I'll talk about that. So that's the overall course. For this first period, we're breaking things up into 2-week periods, and I'm going to cover both weeks in this video. What we're going to go into is we're going to talk about the ethnic identity development process, and we'll also talk about your cross-cultural experiences in that. We're going to talk about your strengths and where you need to grow from a cross-cultural perspective. Defining cultural intelligence and describing its importance for managers. Many of you have heard emotional intelligence. There's also a term cultural intelligence. Try to really assess what's the line between universal values and more relative cultural and personal preferences. And then all that is really going to feed into the first part of this project. So why is this important? Well, part of the reason is the world is changing. The world is becoming much more integrated. This map is the one that I think that Christians in the Western world need to get used to. We like to put the Western world at the center of the map, but the center of Christianity now is moved to the south, and it is really now centered with Africa having the biggest growth. But the same is true within, just about any country. Most countries are becoming much more diverse. There's a lot more, cross-cultural interactions that are happening. Now, with us being a nonprofit and ministry focus, I'm going to talk a little bit about, what's really happening globally among Christians. So it used to be that Christianity was a Western religion, but that has changed over the past 100 years especially, now where the majority of Christians are in the global south or in the non-Western countries. So this red line shows the number of Christians that are outside the West, and the orange line shows the West. That becomes even more significant. So you have close to 2 billion Christians outside the West and less than 1 billion in the West. That becomes even more significant whenever you look at the growth, where by 2025, 99% of the growth is going to be outside the U.S. So what I'm going to be doing in these sessions is, this is really kind of a survey. It's almost like a sampler of what's going to be covered in this 2 weeks. And I'm just going to give a quick overview and kind of explain part of the purposes of it. In many ways, what we're trying to do is give you a cross-cultural utility belt. So this first part, I was explaining, okay, this is the context. The world's changing. This stuff's really important. One of the first tools, and actually this might be the most useful tool I've come across, is the ethnic identity development process. Some of you may have read a book by Tatum called "Why Are All the Kids Sitting Together? Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria." Psychologists have noted that people go through common stages, and in Tatum's book, they talk about 6 stages. I've tried to simplify that just for presentation into 4 stages. I condensed some of the earlier stages. And really, you start off in stage 1, where, if you look at very young kids, they don't even know, they're not even aware of their racial and social identity. And to a certain extent, a lot of people, who grow up in majority culture, they will say phrases like, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. Well, that's actually an unawareness stage statement. And because you actually have to recognize differences to be able to know that people might have other preferences than you. So stage 2 is where you're growing awareness, and hopefully for some of you, we can help you go deeper in stage 2. Stage 3 really is a heart level thing. You have to be immersed in that. You need to immerse in another culture, and you need to identify in another culture. Whenever you ask, who are your people? Well, as Christians, who are our people is a pretty broad thing. Jesus identified with the poor. He identified with, the sick. How are we doing that? And the last stage in this is where we've, in many ways, gone to the other side of forgiveness. I don't like the idea of cheap forgiveness, and there's a lot that needs to happen before you, get to deep forgiveness. Often it can, take years or decades to get into the stage 4. And often, if you view yourself as I do, you're going to have different parts of yourself that are at different, stages. So, if I went and I were in Thailand, there's going to be a lot of cultural things I'm just unaware of. And where there might be other other things where I've worked extensively across, African American and white communities, where I might, a lot of those interactions I might be more in stage 3 or stage 4. So that's one tool. Read through that. You're going to have, exercise related to that. So another tool that I think is important, just in this, is kind of explaining the awareness. A lot of times people look, we live in a Western culture, and we have individualistic framework, right? And then we look at what are the different types of injustice, or even racism, or classism, or whatever you want to call it. And most of what we focus on is this first quadrant, which is individuals who are intentionally being racist. So bigotry, selfishness, bullying, that is that is one category. But it's also important that we can also have injustice from just not understanding culture, not understanding someone's perspective, unintended offenses. It can be easy to go into another country and you go and try to shake hands and they take offense with that, or you eat with the wrong hand, or things along those lines. Now, that's not injustice, that's, offense, but it becomes injustice whenever hundreds of people are doing that to a person, each day. And then, so that's the top column. The bottom column is the collective systemic. So where you have unjust laws, you have policies that create an unequal playing field, you have exploitation, unjust war, imperialism, and that would be where it would be, intentional. We want the land that you have in this country, so we're going to take it. That's some of the U.S. history with Native Americans. Or, we're going to hold this country as a colony because it has resources that we want. But then there's unintentional, where it might just be, a collective effect, second order effect, or cultural encroachment or assimilation. Just like the idea in the U.S., skin-colored Band-Aids are the color of white people. And, there's hundreds of other examples like that. I think the lesson in this is that people assume injustice comes from quadrant 1, but most of it comes from quadrants 3 and 4. So another concept tool set is from Ralph Winter. It's the concept of cultural distance. This is an optional reading, but actually it's one of the most helpful, so I'd encourage you to read it. One of the things that he did is he categorized evangelism, but this could apply towards any sort of cross-cultural interaction. And he said that there's 3 tiers of evangelism. So there's renewal to Christians of the same culture. So that would just be, that's not, necessarily cross-cultural. Evangelism would be evangelism to people of the same color. So that's E1 evangelism. E2 would be cross-cultural missions. So that would be if I am a white, or say someone who's white middle class and they're going to minister to someone who's black middle class. That's going to be E2. E3 would be cross-cultural missions to a radically different culture. That might be, E3 I would say is more of a spectrum. So if I went and I were with an indigenous population in Papua New Guinea, they're just, the cultural distance would just be dramatic. But also in the U.S., one of the things I've noticed, if someone is, say, upper middle class white, and then they want to minister to someone who is destitute and African American, or vice versa, someone who's upper middle class black ministering to someone who's white destitute, there's more than one dimension that they're going across, and that becomes a lot more significant. So one of the key points that I would say the missions world has understood is that we should be focused on raising up indigenous leaders. So the most effective, the way missions has traditionally worked is you send people from a different culture, but when the church growth really takes off is whenever indigenous leaders take that over. So that's the first part. Now, what I want to go into is going into the assignment. So I'm going to just give an overview from Populi. So in Populi, if you click on the lessons, now be sure you go through and look through the course introduction. There's a couple things in there that's really important. One is to look at the final product template and to go through the syllabus for this, and make sure that you have the textbook.